Hey guys, sorry I was gone for a while. I was taking some time out to think about what I wanted to do next, some various things I'd like to work on, um, and also just to take a little more time to kind of get myself together and kind of think about the direction I want this channel to go, some things I'd like to talk about, what I would say about the things I want to talk about. And also part of that was doing like some research, specifically uh, about Emily Dickinson, because I had mentioned previously that I wanted to do a video about Emily Dickinson's poetry. Well, that got me to thinking, well, what exactly do I want to say about it? What do I want to talk about in regards to it? Do I talk more about Emily herself? Do I talk about just her writing? Do I talk about both? Um, what can I say about these things? What can I say about Emily Dickinson? What can I say about her writing? And more so, what can I say that hasn't already been written about extensively? And at the end of it, I just came to my own conclusions. And I realized that there's already been a ton of things written about both Emily and her poetry. There's been numerous biographies and critical studies of her work. There's been numerous analysis of her poetry and its possible meanings and its definitions, her influences, her avant-garde approach to things, her writing style being heavily influenced by traditional hymns, her views on spirituality, her kind of spiritual positions that seem to waver back and forth between devout transcendentalist religious person and doubtful skeptic. Her influences that seem to come from a belief in God, but seemingly having both a simultaneous closeness and a distance from said God, while rejecting traditional Christianity, rejecting things like prayer, going to church, things like that, and how those things have influenced and informed her writing and herself. Like, there's a lot of things I could talk about. Like, there's a deep wealth of material, and in a way that actually made it harder for me to do this video because there's so much to say that has already been said that I can't really add anything new. I can't bring anything that hasn't already been said to the table. So that left me with, well, what can I say? What can I bring from my own impressions of her and her work to the video? What can I deliver from like me and how I read her work? And that got me to thinking further, which, again, delayed time between when I can, do a video. Because I had to kind of think about what I really, one, how I really felt about her work, and two, to reread a bunch of it. I've read a lot of her poetry in the last few weeks, and I've even read about her. I'm actually reading a biography of her right now. But I guess this will just be like a loose form vlog about what I take away from Emily Dickinson. That being said, I guess I can just go into how I feel about what I know of her. Now, obviously, I don't know Emily Dickinson, nor will I ever have the chance to know Emily Dickinson. But from everything I've read about her, from things I've read about her in like biographical essays, to a biography book I'm reading right now, to reading her poetry itself, to even reading like letters she wrote. She was fascinating. She was very interesting. Needless to say, a lot of other people said the same thing. But the thing that makes her interesting to me personally is I feel a lot like I can relate to her in a lot of ways. Like, how she seemed to view things is a lot how I view things both in the past and how I still view a lot of things. Her attitudes towards people, relationships, family are very similar to mine, as well as her preference for solitude, her need to create and make art apart from the world, to make art specifically for her own audience and her own enjoyment. I heavily relate to that. Everything I do creatively, even these YouTube videos, are more out of a desire for me to think and create and make something more just for me than for anyone else. I mean, obviously I want an audience. I want people to enjoy what I do. I want a platform for my work. I want it to be seen. But at the end of the day, what I'm doing it for, it's not them, it's for me. And that seems to be the attitude in which she approached her poetry. Not only that, but while I'm an atheist, she definitely had a sense of spirituality that I find interesting. I find the unconventional aspect of it interesting. I find that while she had this kind of spiritual closeness or oneness, it was also very distant in her approach to God. She rejected conventional Christianity. She rejected traditional things like going to church. She even claimed that she was unable to pray, which is very interesting. And I got the sense from everything I've read about her, and definitely from reading her poems, that her prayer was creativity. It was talking directly to the divine through her writing, but also experiencing the divine from nature. She would talk about how, while others found God in a pew on Sunday morning, she would find God in, like, nature, and, like, the music of birdsong, and through solitude and quiet. Which, when I did believe in spiritual things like that, I also approached it that way, because that to me was kind of the voice of the divine. And even when I did believe that way, I also wrote poetry that was influenced by my spiritual views, that were more intimate talks with God, as well as expressions of what I felt, what I thought. And her kind of eccentricity and rejection of societal norms and conventions is prevalent in her life and in her work, and is talked about, especially in the poem, one of our well-known poems that says, "I'm nobody, who are you nobody too?" Which I read as a kid and immediately connected with it on that level. Like, I totally get what she's saying. Because, we were both, I realize now, wanting to be far from the maddening crowd and be ourselves and be unique weirdos with our own things to say, and, embrace and express our individuality. And she was definitely one of a kind. She was an American original. So about her personally, from what I can glean, she definitely seemed unique. She definitely seemed like somebody I would have had a lot to talk about with. And honestly, we could have even probably have been friends. I don't know. But I'm also very reclusive, like she was. I don't like going out. I don't like interacting with the world. Just another thing in this stew of common ground between us. And there's all, like I said, there's the more surface level connections. Like, we're both creative people. We're both artists. And those that don't know, I'm a writer. I write a lot of poetry myself. I write short fiction. I write nonfiction. I keep a blog where I write essays. I feel that need to create and express myself that way, and like she did, except she wasn't as public as I am about it. Whereas I publish things in public platforms online, she never published anything in her life. She would write down all these hundreds of poems that were kind of just for her, and she would press them in unique volumes that she would keep away. She would put in a drawer or something. And while her family knew about them, they never read them. And the only like writing the world knew at the time was what she would include like in letters and things. She even sent some of her poems off to a publisher. I believe his name was Thomas Higgins, I want to say. And, you know, she wanted his critical evaluation of them. She was like, do you think these are fit for publication? Do you think I need to change anything? And, you know, Emily being Emily, it was, you know, it was ahead of the curve, to say the least. And he was like, you know, woman, what the hell is this? I mean, he was very nice about it. I mean, he was actually a friend of hers, and they interacted through letters. But, you know, approaching Emily's poetry in her lifetime, when poetry was so traditional, it's so kind of bound to traditional, like, structure and rhythm, and, you know, meter was very important, and, you know, the way of writing it was very set in stone. There was very traditional types of poetry that hadn't been deviated from, and it wasn't really a little till about this time or later that innovations in poetry were starting to kind of become popular and well known. You know, it was just in this time, or probably a little later, when, you know, Whitman was publishing his very long poems with long verses and long lines. But at the time, you know, attitudes to poetry were very, like I said, they were very traditional. They were bound in what had come before, and so since Emily was doing things that were definitely not the norm and very experimental for the world, whereas it was just her natural way of writing, to him, I can see where it was quite jarring. He seemed to be like, I don't understand this, and he talked about in his letter to her that like you know, you have no sense of regular rhyme or meter. This is very off. It's like it seems to like slow down and speed up randomly, and you know, I'm very flabbergasted. And you know, coming from a traditional background and not familiar with anything like that, I can definitely understand. It makes sense how he would be flabbergasted at that. And she was like, well, fuck you, I like it. Not that she would ever have been so crass as that. She was very eloquent, well-spoken, and very civil woman. That's the Jason way of phrasing how she responded to him. But she was very witty, and like she wrote back, you know, a clever answer like, well, I'm happy in how I meander along and, you know, perambulate through these lines, things like that. It was very funny. You know, it's great. Emily was a very interesting woman. And actually reading about her, I feel more of a sense of her as a person. Growing up, I'd always loved her poetry, but regarding her, I didn't really know much about her life and who she was. And she'd always felt to me very alien. She felt very foreign. Like, I kind of had this mental image of her as, like, being this almost inhuman entity that kind of operated in her own, like, universe and didn't really interact with anyone, you know. Like, she was kind of out of touch with everything. And while that's true in reality, I mean, she was quite in her own orbit, so to speak. She wasn't that odd. I mean, she knew how to talk to people. She was intelligent. She was witty. You know, as far as like how she was in her day-to-day life and her interactions with her sisters and her father, she was a woman of her time. She was like anyone else. She wasn't some strange kook that they kept chained in the attic. She was, you know, in the mundane aspects of her life, a normal woman. She was interesting. But beneath that, you know, her mind was on another level. And I mean that. I mean, she was brilliant. She was thinking in ways that were challenging and considered unacceptable for her time. She was creatively, light years ahead of her time, and I like she had a very kind of free thinking way of looking at things. She questioned things, she challenged things, even especially the traditional like religious authority at the time and religious outlooks in time. Well, she, naturally and logically was like, well, why? Why do you guys believe this? Like, why should I surrender my beliefs and myself to this unknowable alien idea of this savior, this God, while at the same time feeling very intimately connected with this God through her poetry, even borrowing not only, like I said, influence from hymns, but imagery and words and phrases from the Bible throughout her poetry and throughout her letters she wrote to people. And I suppose I should just get to the writing itself. I've kind of talked about her like personally and like what I've kind of gathered from her, but that to me is just as important as the writing itself. And to me, you can't talk about Dickinson's writing without talking about Dickinson herself. The two are, they go hand in hand. They're inexorably connected. If you talk about Dickinson, you have to talk about her poetry. And if you talk about her poetry, you have to talk about her. Because who she is so infused in her writing that they're inseparable. You can't take them apart. You take one little element out of it, the whole thing goes out the window. It all collapses. So that was kind of that rambling kind of spiel about her and her attitudes and everything are, to me, a natural introduction into talking about her writing. Because, that's the one thing about it is like reading about her and then rereading a lot of these poems. These poems shine with their personality. They are, they are definitely, like I said, interconnected. You can't have one without the other, and you can't have the other without the one. But about the writing itself, I will talk a little bit about that. So just in her own writing, apart from like any biographical stuff I wanted to say, there's a lot of character. There's a lot of originality, needless to say. The way she wrote, the way like her cadences and language, the musicality of her writing is very unique. Like she definitely marched to her own drum, and the music that was in her head was very lively. Like when I read these, I can almost hear what I imagine she sounded like, kind of singing a lot of these like poems, a lot of these like little songs. And some of them were based on like hymns from like hymn books. Like you could sing some of these little songs to the tune of like traditional hymns, and some of them are more very avant-garde and are too erratic for that. They don't fit traditional hymn structures. Some of them do kind of start off at one kind of like rhythm, and then will suddenly jump to a much faster one or a slower one. The syllable count will start off slow or measured and then become suddenly like more rapid, or lines will start off shorter, at the end of a poem will be longer. Things like that, giving it a sudden sense of urgency and immediacy. There's a feeling of it's a feeling of like when I'm listening to it and I'm thinking of poetry in relation to music. Like if I'm hearing, which I do when I read poetry, I hear musical accompaniment. When I hit lines like that, it suddenly feels to me like almost like jazz music. Like it hits a sudden like speed of tempo, and if you were to sing it as written, it would be in a very like almost bebop scat kind of singing, because it would go from like a slow cadence of lines read like this, 2 syllables count to the way it's written like this, like the way I'm talking right now, into a much speeded up fast, way, like singing. It was very, it's very interesting. And that's not the case with all of her poetry, but there are a lot of do that. And then there's some that are very consistently the same rhythm throughout, the same pattern. And there's some that are all very long-winded and very rapid tempo. There's some that feel very slow and somber. And that's another thing, there's many moods, many emotions connected to these poems. I don't know what exactly her writing habits were, but I got the sense that she was continually always running throughout the day, throughout the night. I think I read somewhere that in the book I'm reading, I think it talks about how she'd get up in the middle of the night and go to her desk and write something that she had was thinking or dreaming about. So pretty much all time she would just scribble down little poems to herself. And because people are so dynamic and full of many moods and emotions, it makes sense that when collected it presents a very mosaic view of the woman. There's a lot of somber things in here. There's a lot of happy things. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of sorrow. There's a lot of ambivalence. There's a lot of doubt, anger. All these things are in here. There's a lot of imagery too. My God, not just the religious imagery, not just the whole paradisical religious talking about biblical heaven and Eden and scenes from the Bible and scenes of the divine and impressionistic views of what she probably imagined God to look or be like. There is a lot of everyday scenery in here. There's a lot of nature scenery. There's a lot of seasonal talk. And her writing is very image based, which is something I don't think people think about. There's a lot of in her writing itself, in the lines, there's a lot of different scenes playing almost like the visuals to a movie or something. A lot of color, a lot of brightness, a lot of shadow. For example, there's a short one here. I'm just going to read it to you because this is an example. It says, "Endow the living with the tears you squander on the dead. And they were men and women, now around your fireside. Instead of passive creatures, deny the cherishing, till they, the cherishing deny, with death's ethereal scorn." That's full of itch. See, that right there is already an example of that. You get images of the living, images of the dead, images of sorrow and happiness, and the ideas of, the idea of why only cry for the dead when you should cry for lost people in the living, or cry tears of happiness for the living that you know them. They can be taken different ways, the cherishing denial with the death's ethereal scorn. I mean, that already conjures up images of darkness and shadow and finality, as well as happiness, in the same 2 stanzas. That's impressive to me. It's very creative. There's a lot of things in here about images of the sea, of the sky, of the stars, autumn leaves. And then there's some things that aren't quite physically described that give off impressions. This one that says, "I tried to think a lonelier thing than any I'd seen, some polar expiation and omen in the bone of death's tremendous nearness. I probed retrieveless things, my duplicate, to borrow, a haggard comfort springs. From the belief that somewhere within the clutch of thought there dwells the other creature of heavenly love forgot. I plucked at our partition as one should pry the walls between himself and horror's twin with opposing cells. I almost strove to clasp his hand. Such luxury it grew that as myself could pity him. Perhaps he pitied me. That's very interesting. Things like The Lonelier Thing, things written in capital, with capital T, and that produces like all kinds of weird, shadowy, phantasmagoric kind of imagery of what the thing could be. What does the thing look like? You know, just in that word, just in these lines. You know, things like omen in the bone. What does that mean? You know, I hear that it summons up imagery of mortality, of skeletal, of death and decay. You know, an omen in feeling. You know, feeling in your soul, so to speak. That sense of finality, feeling that sense of, the nearness of the end of everything. I think that's very interesting, very fascinating. Images, like I said, of heaven, paradise, loneliness, love in various forms, familial, divine, personal, even I'm sure romantic in places. Love is definitely a huge theme within her writing and in her life. So those are just some of my general thoughts. I just wanted to talk about, kind of who she was, what impressions I get from her, things I'd like to kind of talk about, just in relate to how I feel about her, and also just kind of how a lot of her poetry has a lot of imagery to it, and things that vividly call things to my mind. So anyways, I appreciate it. Thanks for watching. Sorry I waited so long to get this out here, but I really need to take my time and talk about what I felt, was proper. I wanted to take my time to properly, do this. I didn't want to just rush a video out like I was doing, because I realized now I was just getting them out there really quickly without taking the proper time to think about what I really wanted to say and go over anything I wanted to talk about. They were too hasty, in my opinion. So, having collected myself and my thoughts about what I actually wanted to talk about and present them in a way that I felt is closer to how I actually want to talk about something, I already feel this is a much better video than ones I made in the last several months. So, again, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for subscribing. If you're new to this channel and you want to hear me talk about other stuff, including more writing, subscribe. So, thanks for watching, and I don't know when I'll talk about the next thing. I might take even longer the next time. We'll see. But stay tuned. So, I'll have other things in the future. So, until then, appreciate it. I will catch you later. Bye.